speaking, as I said before, the conjunctions we use are of a limited set. Another way that spoken language is connected is through the anecdotes that we tell, the stories that we tell when we're speaking. And most conversations include some kind of short narrative where people tell a story for a particular effect. Maybe to make people laugh, maybe to make them feel sympathetic, etc. And these stories have a particular structure, and this has been analysed at some length, different kinds of structure that a spoken story has. It usually begins with some kind of location. This place, I was down the road the other day when the people, I met this man who, sequence of events, blah, 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 a complication. The story is not a story unless it has a complication, otherwise why tell it? And usually some kind of resolution to the complication, and then maybe some kind of evaluation of this. And this is very typical. We see this in miniature in these two stories. This woman who was driving on some of this country weather. So that was the background, the person, the location, and then we've got a succession of complicating incidents. This figure moved out of the darkness and put the tarpaulin over a car. That's the climax, if you like, and then the evaluation, you would feel very spooked. And these kind of story sequences are very common. Okay, so I've got 10 minutes left. I just want to sort of summarize now. So what are the implications of it? And we haven't looked at a tenth of the different features of spoken language, but there are enough differences, I think, between spoken grammar and written grammar, and spoken language generally and written grammar, to raise the question of, well, should we be teaching this? Should we be teaching this as a separate grammar?
Yes.
Or should we assume that learners will pick it up anyway, if they're exposed to enough authentic spoken language? Or should we assume that maybe not appropriate for our learners because they may not be using colloquial spoken language anyway? So these are the kinds of arguments that have been going on. An article that came out a few years ago in Applied Linguistics argued strongly that we should be teaching spoken language as a different system. He says it would seem that in teaching the spoken language, typically conversation, standard English, that is the English in traditional grammar books, is an inappropriate model because its grammar differs too much from the grammar of conversation. This is quite a strong argument, saying it's so different that we cannot assume that by teaching standard grammar, which is based on written grammar, that students will extrapolate, that they'll be able to infer how spoken, and this is a problem, because if you look at course books, traditionally at least, even in their dialogues of spoken English, they tend to use written grammar. You don't find phrasal chunks. You don't find sentences that start and then restart. You don't find 90% of the features we've just been looking at. What you find is, hello, Mabel, how are you today? Did you have a nice weekend? Yes, I did have a nice weekend. I went to the beach. What did you do at the beach? Was it crowded? That kind of thing. Nobody talks like that. Not even David Christie. But that's the argument, is that, or perhaps a compromise view, is that spoken grammar and written grammar coincide in many important features. There are many features that are the same. Past tense, for example, we don't change, degrees, etc., modality, etc. So, but there are areas of spoken grammar which are different from, and there are areas of written grammar which we don't use in speech. Can you think of one? An area of written grammar that we don't use in speech. Think of backshift. Backshift, you know what backshift is? Backshift in reported speech. She said she had been working all day. She said she had been working all day. Nobody says that. She said, I've been working all day. Now we would use direct speech there. We would very rarely use reported speech. This kind of shifting the tense back. That's a feature of written language, not a feature necessarily of spoken language. Things like that, you see that, and also some of those conjunctions we mentioned before, however, moreover, notwithstanding, we wouldn't use those. Okay, so just to summarize, this is from another list from Jeffrey Leach, looking at the same thing based on corpus data. He came up with this list of some of the features of spoken grammar, which we've looked at. Some of them we haven't mentioned. Loose relatively unintegrated structure with a very wide range of use of independent non-clauses, these fragments. Yeah? The idea that we speak in sentences is simply not true. The sentence is appropriate for describing written language. The utterance is the appropriate word, perhaps, in lieu of sentence for describing spoken language. Simplicity of phrase structure, and that's something we haven't mentioned. The noun phrases, which especially in academic writing tend to be massive, but in spoken language they tend not to be. And then, very important here, the repetition of restricted lexical. Now that's to say, we're not using a huge repertoire. We're not using all the grammar that we know when we write. We're not using the vocabulary. You know, the spoken vocabulary is relatively limited, particularly in casual conversation. You can get by on maybe 2,000 words, which you can't get by on 2,000 words if you're writing anything beyond emails or texting. And finally, these grammatical features which reflect the interactiveness and the online processing constraints. That is the fact that it's spontaneous and you're processing in real time. Okay, so that's it. Yes, so we've got 5 minutes for any questions.